Welcome to Liberty Talk. I'm Odessa Orlowitz. So remember I had on Ron Valent probably 3 or 4 times over the last 5 years, and he was warning what this UNDRIP agenda for British Columbia and quite frankly all of Canada, but we are the testing ground. I live in Vancouver, BC. So he was warning that these little things that they were putting into place would eventually mean that First Nations or Indigenous could basically claim that they own the entire province and get out if you're white or if you're not Indigenous. So get out Filipinos, get out South Asians, get out Chinese, get out Mexicans, get out all taxpayers except for people whose what blood proves that they were here first. This is getting so crazy that even John Rustad, who is the opposition party leader locally here in the province of BC, even he has come out to say this is insane on a Twitter post. The same John Rustad that just months ago was bowing down to the First Nations lobby group in regards to what Dallas Brody said. So if he actually has the balls to come out and say, this is absolute insanity, you know things have gotten pretty bad. But finally, John is seeing that if people don't speak up, I'm going to show you a clip of a video of a First Nations lady basically saying, oh, no, not basically. This is what she said. I'm going to show you. We don't care about anybody else, and we don't care about anybody else's children. We only care about First Nations children, and everybody else is a visitor. So here's the thing. Now, First Nations bands that are not given title to land, not in a court of law, they haven't gone to hash it out in the court of law. They've not been given title to land on provincial parks, and they don't care. They're now closing parks to anybody that their blood isn't First Nations, even though they don't own it. They've not been given title. Now, court cases and government have given First Nations title in a few places, and they had to prove that a long time ago, they weren't just nomads that didn't stay on land long and were traveling, because in most cases, the First Nations weren't actually settling and using an area and building infrastructure and community for that long. They are supposed to prove that they actually took over an area for a certain amount of time and it was their settlement. So they've been able to prove that in very few places. So this whole unceded territory, First Nations are now saying that anything that's unceded territory, mean not proven in a court of law that they actually owned that land, they want to declare that they own it, and they want to be able to kick off most of British Columbia population from 95% of the land. And if you don't think that's true, it has just started for the last 3 years, I believe it is. We're going to look at the video. 3 years where even though they don't have title, they've just said nobody else can come into this park unless you're First Nations. So what does that mean? Let's say, there's a man who's First Nations, but his wife is, I don't know, Caucasian or Filipino. And does that mean that their kid, who would then be considered either mixed race, depending on who that person had sex with, does that mean that the First Nations man can go into the park with the offspring and the wife has to sit in the car? Will she be asked to leave? Or vice versa? A woman who's First Nations has a non-First Nations husband. Does she get to go into the park with the child because they're a mix and he doesn't? Are they going to start doing blood testing and passports? They know that the non-First Nations people, the taxpayer is paying for that provincial park upkeep, etc. They don't care that you are paying for that park with your taxes. They have kicked out anybody that is not Indigenous, even though they don't own the land, and that is illegal. Now, David Eby, the NDP government, has got themselves in such a pickle, they're not doing anything about it. They're just letting it happen because this is the agenda and this is what we warned you about. These people are so racist. This woman literally says out loud, I don't care about any child except First Nations child, and the rest of you can leave BC.
It is time that Canada realizes that they are on stolen land, and it's time that Canada gives it back.
So how much land and where would that land be when you say it should be given back?
All of this land.
So the whole country?
The whole country. I'm not thinking about other Canadians. I'm thinking about children.
But what about the children who don't have Indigenous heritage?
I'm thinking about our own. This is our land. This is our home. Everybody's just a visitor.
So is she right? Give it all back? Just a little? None? Today, I bring you a sit-down report with a man named Ron Vaillant. I first came across Ron on a commentator show, Odessa Orlowitz, called Liberty Talk. And after that, many of you reached out to me asking me to do this story. And I think it's important too.
How would they manage to do that without a population paying leases, paying to help out? They don't population-wise have the infrastructure to run a province and have it with the roads and all the things that they need. So they basically are saying, and I'm not saying it's all First Nations, it's not. I've actually been getting private messages from people that are First Nations that have watched my show for the last 5 years, ones that have thanked me for warning them about this. And I can't say this because I'm actually going to try to put this episode on YouTube. My last 3 were removed, so I'm having no luck on YouTube again, but I do want to put this one on YouTube. So I've had First Nations thank me for warning them about this and say we're really embarrassed about the way some of them are acting. But the fact that the NDP David Eby government is allowing a precedent to be set that First Nations, even though they haven't won in court, even though they don't have title, are saying only people with our blood can come in here. That means that all the other bands and nations are going to get, well, that's a great idea. We're just going to start declaring we own things, and all the other taxpayers that pay for the upkeep of that area can't come in. David Eby and the NDP Marxist government are allowing this precedent to be set 3 seasons in a row. I'm going to show you other things that are going on that basically show that everything that we've been saying for the last 5 years is starting to happen. David Eby's also made a statement that now he's allowing First Nations to veto projects. Just veto projects. They get to decide what happens in this province and what doesn't, even though they're a minute population. So it sure looks like what Rosa Quarry was warning us about, that they'll use First Nations because they know the emotions of the First Nations. A lot of First Nations hate anybody that's not First Nations. Not all, but a lot. And they're getting their way. That they'll just say, oh, we own all of this land. They won't prove it. They won't prove that they weren't moving around as nomads, that they actually had settled on 95% of British Columbia, which is actually logistically impossible, so that all the plebs that are not First Nations, who are the taxpayers, who are paying the way of First Nations right now, they are going to be pushed into these mega cities where everybody lives in a Rubik's Cube, pays astronomical rent, astronomical taxes. And those people that are the tax-paying citizens that are not First Nations, they will pay all this money to live in these cramped places while the First Nation gets to enjoy everything that's not in a cramped area. And guess what? We pay for it. That's how they're going to get the majority of human beings off the land. Now, you might say, Odessa, you're exaggerating. This is only 1 park or 2 parks, or it's only that band over there that's being vicious, or that one. Well, if that's true, why is David Eby letting precedent be set at this provincial park that we pay for, you with your taxes, so you have less money at the end of the year to pay for that park, but you're not allowed in there. So, okay, if they want title to all of these places and are claiming they own it, then that means we don't have to pay for the park anymore, right? So the band or First Nations, they can pay for the upkeep of the park, can't they? If they claim they own it. But no, they want you to keep paying for it. Well, they say they're the only ones allowed in. Remember when this was conspiracy theory and they said that would never happen? What is wrong with David Eby and his government that they're not saying to this First Nation, you guys don't have title over that park? The absolute racism being projected at the tax-paying citizens who are paying for the upkeep of this is actually comical. And the fact that our province is allowing it to happen shows the direction the David Eby NDP government wants this to go. I would like to ask the First Nations that are not letting people into a park how it works. What if you have two First Nations, man and woman, who adopted 3 kids from Africa? Are the Africans allowed in? How does this slippery slope work? But according to the news, it's just racist to even talk about this. So not only am I going to show a video that some of you might have seen, it's super short, I'm going to show you what John Rustad has said. I'm going to show you a video that Drea Humphrey put together that shows what these people literally want to do now that Ebby's given them the courage to do it. And I'm also going to read out to you some bills that Adrian Spitters is warning about that will help continue this slippery slope. Not so slippery. They're doing it right in front of our face. And if you're not clear about how it works, unceded territory means the First Nations have not proven they own it, they've not won in court, and they've not been given title. Most of BC is unceded. All right, video 1.
You might be wondering, what's with all the fuss around the closure of Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park? 2 years ago, 2 First Nations unilaterally shut down the park, one of the most popular parks in BC, excluding any non-Indigenous British Columbians from accessing it, right in the middle of peak season. The nations had no legal authority to do so, yet the BC government not only acquiesced, but actually sent park officials to turn non-Indigenous visitors away. They repeated the closure last year, and again this year, and likely next year and the year after that too. Now, it's easy to think, what's the harm in this? Well, it's important to understand that the Joffrey Lakes closure was done on the basis of the park being within the nation's traditional territory, where title has been asserted but not established in the courts. So if we're now in a place where the mere assertion of title confers the right to prohibit public access to public spaces, then we all need to be aware that over 100% of BC's landmass is claimed as unceded traditional territory.
Now, if you don't know what asserted, title's been asserted means, if you look it up, asserted means some First Nations have said we own it. That's all it means. So I can go assert that that house across the street I own. So if I go across the street and say I actually own that land, I actually own that house, even if I don't, I've just asserted that I own it. So the word asserted is a bit of a psyop word. I've asserted that I own that, so I do. So in other words, they just said, hey, we own it, so get out, even though they don't, and they don't own it, and they haven't gotten title. They've just declared they own it.
By one or more of the province's 200 plus Indigenous groups. That means we have to ask, what would prevent more closures like this, not just in other parks, but in relation to any other public lands? The reality is it's divisive, it sets a terrible precedent, and it's just plain wrong. One thing it isn't is complicated. BC's beautiful provincial parks belong to all British Columbians.
Okay, Carolyn Elliott also is quite well known in the press. She's been on mainstream media. She's a well-known presence, and she's quite well respected, so she's probably about to get canceled. But anyways, she wasn't before. She says land acknowledgements are indeed political, and it's not just universities, but elementary schools. At all assemblies after a land acknowledgement, her kids have to sing the Coast Salish anthem, an anthem for an ancestry-based group they can never belong to, let alone vote for. So in our Marxist ways, these children are being forced to sing an anthem, not O Canada, but an anthem for a group of people they're not allowed to belong to. and now can't use one of their parks. Do you see how twisted that is? And I don't want to forget, I don't have time because this episode's going to get too long, but a video was shown about 3 bands that are fighting with each other over an area that they all claim is theirs. These bands are fighting over, just within bands, who was there first, who stayed there the longest, whose area it was way back when. They're infighting now because they all want power and they all want land. So this is setting up this slippery slope. This is getting ridiculous. This is a nightmare. They're just setting up a nightmare scenario. It's all about money. Everything's always about money. So she says, don't just like or comment, act. Copy the message I've made below and send it to the ministers responsible. Flood their inboxes and make them feel the pressure. It's very important that we do this. So she says, and thank you for this, send to George Heyman, Minister Environment, env.minister@gov.bc.ca. I'm going to put that in the description. And Christine Boyle, Minister of Indigenous Relations, irr.minister@gov.bc.ca. Subject, reopen Joffrey Lakes to all British Columbians. And she's even written here what you need to say to Minister Heyman and Boyle. We are writing as citizens of BC and Canada to demand immediate and unrestricted access to Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park for all Canadians. This is not Indigenous land. This is not a reserve. This is a BC park, provincial land funded and protected by generations of taxpayers. These closures have now happened 3 years in a row, blocking weeks of access, enjoyment, and use. The claims of unceded territory is a political phrase, not a legal status. No permanent settlements, villages, or native communities existed in the Joffrey Lakes area prior to Confederation. These were nomadic groups with no fixed dwellings or jurisdiction. These tribal bands are not nations. Even Treaty 8 refers to native bands as tribes, not sovereign states. Those who take part in Canadian programs, accept Canadian dollars, use Canadian roads, hospitals, mail, law enforcement, and governance systems have already acknowledged their full inclusion in Canada. Provincial and government land is not racial land. It belongs to all citizens equally, regardless of ancestry. Since the 50s, over $2.6 trillion has been spent on Indigenous programs across Canada, with hundreds of billions in BC alone. We're tired of being pushed out of every public space in the name of politics. We ask you to do your duty, restore full equal access to Joffrey Lakes now, permanently reject racially based park closures, uphold the principles that public land is for all Canadians. We built this province together, we share it together, stop dividing it by race. Sincerely, your name and your city. Use it, send it, share it. Enough is enough. And she is right. Okay, and here's John Rustad. Projects that are in BC's public interest should be prioritized based on what's best for all British Columbians, not based on who happens to own the project. Instead, this is new, guys. David Eby's NDP is giving First Nations an absolute veto over whether or not projects in BC can be given priority status by government. This Eby veto is part of a larger pattern, and it's not normal. Good thing he's noticing. We've only been talking about it for 5 years. Anyway, British Columbians are in agreement on reconciliation and having respect for First Nations culture and rights, including title. However, BC's provincial government is supposed to govern for all British Columbians. And when he says title, he's talking about title where they've proved that they had settled there and created a community there. Continuing on, BC's provincial government is supposed to govern for all British Columbians. Eby's NDP should not be giving any special group, 1, veto on whether or not projects are prioritized by BC's government, 2, veto powers over land rights and access rights on privately owned property in BC. They've literally started to do that to people who own property, like they have a dock that's right there that's for their boat that they've owned for 50 years. Well, First Nations come along and say, get rid of that dock. We own that piece of ocean. This is how immature they're being. And number 3, veto over access to and use of public lands in BC. So he's talking about that park. The BC NDP's Eby veto approach is setting back reconciliation. I agree with him there. driving away investment and undermining BC's economy and breaking down trust between British Columbians. What he means by trust between British Columbians, he doesn't want to say it out loud, so I'll be forced to because this is Liberty Talk Canada. Trust between First Nations and non-First Nations. The trust is being broken because they're now literally not letting you in a park that you pay for. BC needs to end the EB veto if we want to get our economy going again, and he is not wrong. All right, they've actually had to set up something called Public Land Use Society, and Carolyn is part of this. Let me show you what this is. Everybody needs to go to this website to see what's actually happening in this province. So the board of directors is Warren Murko and Adam Pankratz and Jonas Rigaud and Dr. Carolyn Elliott. She's the director. And their mission is public land use societies dedicated to ensuring Crown land remains accessible for recreation, resource development, and economic growth while promoting responsible stewardship. We recognize the importance of protecting the rights and privilege of access to Crown land for all British Columbians and safeguarding our shared lands for future generations. They're saying we're all humans. What happened to inclusivity? And everybody's equal. Well, the First Nations don't feel that way. It's quite the opposite, actually. They've become privileged rulers of the land and nobody's allowed in. In fact, like I said, one wants everybody just to move to America. So Public Land Use Society raises public awareness about threats to access and use of public land in British Columbia, ensuring land-based voices are heard. We engage with policymakers, industry leaders, interest groups, and the public to highlight concerns around land use policies and their impacts. We use their feedback to shape public awareness campaigns, fostering unity through grassroots reconciliation, shared interests, and mutual respect. Well, mutual respect is definitely not happening right now. If you want to check out her website or their website, it's publiclanduse.ca. Also, Public Land Use Society monitors and challenges policies that threaten public access, use, environmental stewardship, and economic opportunities on Crown land. I'm laughing here because it actually says that threaten pubic access. So I had to stop for a second. It does. They've got a typo there. No, they're not threatening pubic access. They're threatening public access. We educate and inform BC about their rights and access to Crown lands, as well as the activities they can pursue. And they have a resources page for legal articles and industry challenges, and so on and so on. What's at stake? Across BC, restrictions on both authorized and low-impact activities on Crown land are increasing. Advocacy groups and industry leaders are raising the alarm about growing threats to public land use and access from numerous government ministries, particularly through secretive agreements and the delegation of provincial authority. These undisclosed agreements grant exclusive decision-making powers over Crown land, reducing public oversight and transparency. In other words, you're a taxpayer. They don't care. They don't care. You're going to pay for all this, but you're not going to have access. Now, they warn here that Joffrey Lake is just the beginning. They also have news here, and there's some good articles in here. BC property owners face uncertain future. So they've got articles if you ever want to keep up with what's going on. BC plans to reconcile by giving First Nations veto on land use. BC bargaining away public access to backcountry. BC property owners face an uncertain future. BC NDP prefers autocratic governance. This is true. BC's land use and resource agenda puts economy on shaky ground. Backlash mounts over BC government's land use survey. BC NDP quietly consult on sweeping changes to managing public lands. Feel free to go in here again. It's publiclanduse.ca, and this is in the news section. Here's activities that you can do on Crown land: hiking, rock climbing, boating, water skiing, swimming, snow skiing, non-commercial filming, bird watching, horseback riding, caving, snowmobiling, dirt biking, biking, use of all-terrain vehicles, landing of aircraft, and other similar activities. Under separate regulations and conditions, Crown land can be used for hunting, fishing, fossil collecting, camping, beekeeping, investigative activities, organized events, and more. All right, and let's just see what else they're up to, thanks to an essay Adrian Spitters put out. Adrian Spitters, as you guys know, is who I've worked with. You can find him at adrianspitters.com. He's put out something right now that I think that we should all look at to do with this. British Columbia is the global test case for land seizure. It is. We are. Bill 7 is now law. Part 4 could make government control of private land permanent by the fall of 2025. I know some of you are going to say, wait, the worst parts of Bill 7 were taken out. True, but take a look at this. Now, I still need to have Adrian on to talk about his #1 best-selling book that's on Amazon. It Starts with Gold, co-authored by Peter J. Merrick and Adrian C. Spitters. In the book, we reveal how financial systems are collapsing and how individuals can prepare before it's too late. You can email Adrian if you want to know more about gold, silver, backing up your wealth with gold and silver, the investments you already have, and other investments you can do, because he's showing what is actually happening here is not only is the Canadian economy collapsing, and they're admitting that on mainstream, we have a serious issue right now with people renewing their mortgages and not able to pay them, the tariffs, the domino effect. But here is what he wants to talk to you about to do with my episode. When BC passed the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, Bill 7, on November 8th, 2023, few understood what had just happened. The public was told it was a routine update, just another response to wildfires, floods, and climate change. But in reality, this quiet piece of legislation marks the beginning of a new era, the end of private land ownership as we know it. They are setting up this domino effect. No, it hasn't happened yet, but we're seeing, just with this park thing and with First Nations being able to decide the fate of the province, this is moving forward. This is dripping forward. David Eby has actually done the opposite to quell conspiracy theories. He's proved the conspiracy theories. This is not hyperbole, says Adrian. This is the blueprint. BC is the pilot project, the test lab for global governance through emergency law. What is happening there is being studied closely by bureaucrats, technocrats, and global planners around the world. If it works in Canada, it will be exported everywhere. And that is why we have to rise up and say, we have a nation and a province full of people who are from every type of ancestry, from all over the world. And we're all paying taxes to pay for this infrastructure. Bill 7 radically redefines what constitutes an emergency. It expands the list to include not only natural disasters, but also climate modeling, cyber threats, pandemics, critical incidents, and anything that could disrupt social cohesion. These emergencies do not have to occur, they only need to be predicted. This is one of the most dangerous elements of Bill 7. The government no longer needs actual evidence that something's happening. It only needs a model. That prediction alone can be used to declare a provincial state of emergency, seize land, homes, infrastructure, and personal property, occupy private dwellings or buildings for shelter or storage, extract water, fuel, food, and other supplies, remove trees, or destroy structures. In other words, they just need to be predicted. No damage needs to exist, no fire needs to burn, no floodwaters need to rise. If a government agency or AI model predicts that there may be a future risk, the province can exercise full emergency powers without court orders, without public input, and without due process. This is not government's, this preemptive expropriation, legalized under the banner of safety. It is a shift from responding to real crisis to managing projected threats, a move that removes all checks and balances on the state. This is the same premier that is now allowing First Nations to say, hey, that's our land, you got to keep out. They make a call to Eby's thugs, the thugs show up at the park and go, what's in your blood? What? It's not Indigenous blood? Oh, well, okay, you can go in, you can't. Well, you married him? Well, you're an offspring of him? Oh, you're the cousin? Okay, they're adopted. Okay, well, you two brothers and sisters can go in and you two can't, because that's what somebody over there in the First Nations claims they can do, even though they haven't proven it in court and they don't have title. So that's the same premier allowing that to happen that's also just put this through. Communism 101, Marxism 101, and fascism all rolled into one. You know that David Eby literally lives a 2-minute drive from me? Ugh. Private homes can be converted into emergency shelters. Farms can be cleared to create fire breaks or resource corridors. Stored food or fuel can be taken. Yep, they can come into your storage and just take your food. Water rights can be suspended, structures can be removed or destroyed without consent. While the legislation frames these powers as temporary, the structure of Bill 7 makes confiscation effectively permanent in practice, and we've seen they did it over COVID. Emergencies can be declared indefinitely based on speculative modeling. There's no clear time limits for government control once a property is seized. The province is not obligated to return land or compensate owners meaningfully, and Part 4 would allow Cabinet to regulate land use permanently without ledge review. Now, listen, if they're using climate change as the emergency, it'll never end then because they're saying climate change is forever, it's infinity. So this emergency will just stay. And this is not traditional expropriation, which requires a court process, transparent compensation, and judicial oversight. Instead, Bill 7 creates a model of rolling emergencies where ownership remains on paper, but use, control, and decision making are permanently handed to the state. This amounts to confiscation in all but name. You still pay taxes, though, bear liabilities, and hold title, but you lose functional control of your land, just like Joffrey Park. You still pay for it, but you can't use it. The shadow of Part 4. In March 2025, the most extreme section of the Act, Part 4, was withdrawn in response to public backlash. But make no mistake, Part 4 is coming back. And when it does, it could formalize the permanent suspension of private property rights in the name of climate resilience and risk mitigation. Part 4 is expected to grant Cabinet the ability to issue binding land use regulations without parliamentary approval, enable long-term surveillance of the property, criminalize noncompliance, allow indefinite state intervention under permanent emergency declarations. This is not temporary emergency management, this is permanent regulatory governance, a system where ownership is conditional, revocable, and monitored. The United Nations position on private property rights. Bill 7 aligns closely with a global ideological shift driven by the UN policy, one that's been in motion since the 1976 UN Conference on Human Settlements. In the official conference report, the UN openly stated, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. But it's not social injustice if a tiny population kicks the rest of the province out of a park because they don't have the right blood type. Are you getting the contradiction here now? Are you getting what a joke British Columbia has become? This framework has never been renounced. It simply evolved through documents like Agenda 21, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, a UN strategy to guide urban development policy. Each of these docs reaffirms that land should be managed collectively, not held privately as an untouchable right. Under the worldview, landowners are caretakers whose rights must be balanced or overridden by social, climate, or equity priorities. In this model, private property is conditional, land use is a tool for redistribution. That one's important. Government intervention is viewed as a moral and environmental necessity. British Columbia's Bill 7 is not an isolated overreach. It is the real-world implementation of decades-old UN policy turning legal ownership into administrative stewardship under global climate and equity directives. DRIPA, UNDRIP, and the erosion of private property rights. I'm not able to read the entire thing, guys, because it's very long, so it's going to be in the description. In 2019, BC became the full jurisdiction in Canada to pass legislation aligning provincial law with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. Through the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA mandates that the province take all necessary measures to ensure that laws are consistent with UNDRIP, including provisions related to land rights. While it is framed as a step towards reconciliation, its implementation has raised concerns about the impact on private property rights. For example, the provincial government's denial of a luxury real estate development on James Island, citing potential impacts on Indigenous rights, is seen as a concrete application of DRIPA in a provincial approval process. Globalism, British Columbia. Globalists, British Columbia. Globalist bird flu garbage, 400 dead ostriches in BC. You get my drip here? DRIPA? We're not in control anymore. The globalists are. We are the testing ground, and I happen to live here. One of the most significant threats is the provision for free, prior, and informed consent, which may effectively give Indigenous groups a veto over land use, even on legally held private property, if that land falls within a claimed or traditional territory. Because DRIPA lacks clear definitions of what constitutes Indigenous land or traditional territory, private landowners now face a legal gray zone. Even if their title is valid and recognized by the courts, their rights can be curtailed through administrative decisions that prioritize reconciliation or risk mitigation over property rights. No compensations guaranteed, no judicial process is required. That's called communism and Marxism. As DRIPA intersects with Bill 7, they are all intertwined. This is what I'm trying to tell you guys. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples allows land to be frozen under the guise of Indigenous reconciliation. So you spent 30 years not vacationing, not living the high life so that you could pay off that expensive house, and you can lose it like that because David Eby says so. Together, these frameworks may quietly dismantle the foundation of freehold property ownership in British Columbia, Canada. Now, I have covered this, you guys, over the last 5 years quite extensively. Some of you are new viewers, but it's really important we're bringing it up again because you're actually seeing this happen in real time. BC isn't just adopting this framework, it's becoming the test bed for full implementation. Now, this is interesting too. Embedded within Bill 7 is the policy of intersectional disadvantage. This requires the government to prioritize disaster response based on an identity category rather than geography, vulnerability, or economic need. This means disaster aid may be withheld from those who do not qualify as disadvantaged. You're not Indigenous? You're just a settler? Oh, screw you. You can be homeless then, even though you paid for this property. Enforcement may be harsher for those seen as privileged landholders, right? Because working your bag off 5-6 days a week, doing 40-50 hours of work your whole life just to pay taxes, pay for parks you're not allowed into, pay for over bloated administration. You're so privileged, you white person that works in logging and works in the oil industry, you privileged white person who's slaving away at McDonald's to share a room with 3 others. You're so privileged just because of your heritage and what your parents did, I don't know, 100 years ago. No, you can be homeless. We're just going to give a tiny population of British Columbia everything because David Eby says so. Land use decisions may be filtered through a political lens. Well, that's already happening. The result is a 2-tiered emergency response system. Those that have a certain skin color and those that don't. Because inclusivity. From ownership to occupation, we warned, meaning Adrian and his co-author warned, it starts with gold, that the future of wealth would not be digital. It would be physical and essential. Land, precious metals, and critical infrastructure are the final assets standing in a collapsing system. That makes them the primary targets for state control. Bill 7 confirms this truth. It quietly converts landowners into caretakers for the state. It rewrites ownership as a license to comply. It strips away generations of legal precedent and property rights in favor of an administrative model where the state decides how your land's used. The state decides what upgrades are mandatory. The state decides who gets help and who gets punished. And when Part 4 returns, which we know David Eby will do, sliding it into some other bill or some other document, the state will no longer need your permission or your vote. The window to resist is closing. Fall 2025 marks the line in the sand. If Part 4 of Bill 7 is passed, it will become almost impossible to reverse the transformation of land ownership in BC or to stop that same model from being exported across Canada. And they're saying act now before it's too late. Contact your MLA immediately. Demand that Part 4 be permanently withdrawn when the ledge reconvenes in the fall of 2025. If passed, it could establish permanent government control over your land. Consult legal experts. Educate your neighbors. Secure your wealth in real, unregulated assets. Diversify into physical precious metals stored outside of the government-controlled systems. Explore alternative holdings that cannot be easily seized or regulated. If you want to talk to him more about that, it's Adrian at adrianspitters.com. And lastly, a great video Drea Humphrey did.
The globalist run World Economic Forum's vision for you and I to own nothing by the time 2030 hits, but yet still somehow be happy, may be unraveling in Canada much sooner than we thought. But here's the thing. The tool that's being used potentially to bring that to fruition may not be what you expected. The first city to go ahead and adopt UNDRIP in British Columbia is Vancouver, already pledging to prioritize housing for people of certain First Nations in Vancouver off of reserve land. Now, some of you might be watching this and saying, what's the big deal? We're on unceded territory. Well, the question that still remains is how much land are we talking about? And believe it or not, there's question about who exactly are Indigenous people when it comes to this act. Ron, he is a concerned Albertan who's been talking about UNDRIP for the last few years, and it's been falling mostly on deaf ears when it comes to our lawmakers in this country.
This is the most important untold story in Canada, if not the world. UNDRIP is a United Nations document that's been 20 years in the making. And this is a book right here. And you can see it's not very thick, actually. So I would recommend people look at it. You can find it online, UNDRIP document. And I see it as a weapon of mass destruction for our societies. Because what it does, it's using the Indigenous issue, which people will acquiesce to, in order to create brand new rights, usurping power and everything over other people's. It'll be a two-tiered society.
So for those of you that aren't clear, this is an old video. This is from years ago. I first started speaking out about this with Ron. Well, Ron was first. I brought him on. She's dug up this video from a long time ago, and she's embedded it into a new article about Joffrey Lake, about David Aby's, veto power, where First Nations can just decide on everything now, to show that everything we've been saying is starting to happen. So this is a new article, but this is an old video.
Read the document, they're going to go ahead and say, well, I agree with that, because it's kind of written in that kind of way. But when you see the implications of how it all ties together, it's a monster. But Article 26 states that the Indigenous have the right to the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. This is a very serious issue because all of the land basically in Canada now is being claimed, and that's through Bill C-15. But
I want to help people and myself wrap our heads around this a little bit more, especially the connection between the UN and what we're seeing happening. But also there was, some talk about Vancouver specifically, which is now on board.
Vancouver voted unanimously on June 24th, 2014, to acknowledge that the city is on the unceded territory of these bands. And the city adopted a reconciliation framework stating that bands are the rights and title holders of Vancouver land.
Take a look at this article on the screen right now from Campbell River. This was based a couple of years ago, and that article says, British Columbians, you better wake up.
And one thing I want to mention there about the declarations, when they start meetings, if they're doing that in your community, the land has already been claimed, okay? But anyhow, the UN is an entity made up of all these different countries. 50% of them are dictatorships, and they do not share our way of and our values of life. So what they have done is created this instrument, basically, that is a weapon of mass destruction for our society. And the only way it can be implemented within Canada or BC or even Vancouver is if the politicians go ahead and forward it. And that's exactly what has happened. I posted a video a year ago called Cross the Rubicon. That's his channel. And he went ahead and he talked about the Maori people there, and he was going on there, and he got absolutely crucified in the media as being a racist, lost his job, and he said his life has been ruined on account of being this whistleblower. I think it's going on really in most countries in the world behind the scenes. Even in the US, basically, Biden is talking about having a new relationship with the Indigenous and stuff like that. And so you have to go ahead and look behind the scenes, because up until that point in 2019, when John Horgan went ahead and adopted it for the province, it was all hush, hush, hush behind the scenes. I had private Zoom meetings with people, and one conservative MP, I asked, how come you're not warning people on this? And he was on the standing committee, and he stated that sometimes it's better not to say things. The other conservative MP, he said, it's a shame that no one knows about UNDRIP. And I says, you're the official opposition. I don't see anything on your social media or YouTube. And he says, yeah, but we need help.
What can be done from citizens who say, you know what? No, hold up here. We can't just be giving land based on the UN and where does that stop? What can we do?
Well, yeah, it doesn't stop, because it's not just land. It's a whole bunch of other things. It's governance. It's reparation, like paying for the land use. It's not allowing military to exercise on your land, on their, the land. It's claiming the waters and the resources. It's just absolutely a monster. No one's going to want to be able to do business in Canada when all of this is understood. So we need to have mass awareness, because it's the politicians who are implementing this. So we got to bring the fire to their feet on all of this and get them to stop it. But it's really far down the line at this point in time.
Well, although I'd love to, I cannot show that entire interview too, or this episode will be like 5 hours. So I hope you enjoy the clips I've put together. Thank you so much for listening and understanding what's going on here in BC, Canada. If I was you, I would continue to invest in gold, silver, and precious metals, because now our land ownership is shaky. Our mortgages are becoming shaky. The new interest rates. The economy is shaky. The tariffs are shaking things up. Everything is shaking things up. So I cannot recommend enough that you continue to invest in gold and silver, or back your investments with gold and silver, as it's right now a sure thing that they can't take away from you. Please share this information as to what's happening here in BC, the crazy things that David Eby is allowing with our parks and our public land. Thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate you guys. See you next time. Did you know if the banks do a bail-in, they can take the contents in your bank vault? But storing your gold and silver at home could be a huge security risk. Every day, our dollar is worth less and less. Inflation is stealing the only savings families have. Now more than ever, it's so important to hedge the savings you've worked so hard for. Banks have been failing all over the world, and social credit has all but arrived. But did you know you can do wholesale price vaulting and retail delivery from the most prestigious, reliable company in Canada? Did you also know if you decide to leave Canada, your gold and silver can be sent right to you after you arrive to your destination? The only company I personally use and trust are those awake guys at New World Precious Metals. Take control of your family's future. You can just click the link in my show description or type in the web address libertytalkcanada.ca/gold to get on their mailing list, attend their webinar, or book an appointment. Let them know Odessa sent you.
Restore Effects is the leader in professional paintless clear coat repair. Perfected over 2 decades, our product system surpasses traditional clear coat fixes to pave the future of vehicle reconditioning. Restore Effects permanently removes 99% of damage to your clear coat by replicating and restoring the original paint finish. Reset your vehicle's appearance or put your business fleet's best foot forward, all without repainting. Visit restoreeffects.com and find a center near you.